Martin Luther King gets shot. The country is just in this turmoil over this. Here's what I remember. I remember this incredible tugging and pulling. Does he go to the funeral? Does he not go to the funeral? Does he go to the funeral? Does he not go to the funeral? Nixon's gut thing was, I don't go to the funeral because it's not credible. I mean, I don't, yes, he's a national leader, but I don't like taking advantage of going to a funeral and being there when Martin Luther King and I were not good friends. Now, they had had this relationship before with the father, but not with the son, is my understanding of this. So this tug goes back, and this thing goes back and forth. Finally, there is a solution, and we have dispatched Nick Ruey, who was one of our top people, down to Atlanta. And Nick is there prowling around, figuring out, waiting for instructions as to exactly what's going to happen. What we ended up doing was Nixon used Bob Aplinoff, who's one of his great friends, his airplane, and we flew. It was myself and Mr. Nixon flew to Atlanta. Nick Ruey picked us up at the airport, and he had hired a guy, kind of a limousine driver man, and paid him enough to said this can never be talked about to the limousine driver. We got in the car, and we pull up in front of Martin Luther King's Jr.'s home. We go in and we go up onto the porches. It was a very modest home. And here were all of his children. And Mr. Nixon talked to each one of them and expressed his condolences. We then went down the back hallway and into a bedroom. And laying on the bed with her propped up on pillows was Mrs. Martin Luther King. The president went over and sat on the side of the bed. By the way, he wasn't president. The candidate went over, sat on the side of the bed, took her hand, and started talking to her, and I left the room. And I went back up with the kids. And I would say that Mr. Nixon was in there maybe 5 minutes. Then he came back out, talked to the kids a little bit more. We got into the car, and we drove over to Martin Luther King Sr.'s home, which was entirely different than Martin Luther King Jr.'s. Martin Luther King Jr.'s home was very modest. The senior's home was a very beautiful home in this very lovely neighborhood of Atlanta. And we went in, and many of their friends were there. It was like a wake type feeling there, but more of a social occasion in the sense of people coming to express their grief and so forth. And I don't think they had any idea he was coming over there. And he went in, he found Dr. King Sr. and Mrs. King, expressed his condolences. We were only there, I would say, 10 or 15 minutes. Got in the car, went back to the airport, got on the plane, and went to the Key Biscayne Villas and Hotel in Key Biscayne, Florida. Bibi Rebozo had met us at the airport, drove us over there. So now it is, let's say, 7:30 at night, and I'm in my room. I had actually a little villa, kind of, I'd say 30 yards from Nixon's. And I get this call. He says, "Dwight, can you come over?" So I go over, and he's there with Bibi Rebozo, Jane Lucky, who was Bibi's girlfriend, and Nixon. There three of them are sitting on a couch. It was like a surreal thing. I mean, watching some television show. And he says to me, he said, "Dwight, how's our trip to Atlanta playing?" And I said, "Sir, I have no idea. I'll go check." So I go back and I call John Whitaker, who had been the point man on putting all of this together with Nick. And I said, "John, I think we've got a problem. Mr. Nixon is asking how it's playing." John says, "What the hell do you mean?" He said, "This whole thing was to be off the record. Nobody was to know." And I said, "Well, he's asking me. about how it's playing. I think he thought it was going to leak or something. So he said, you better go check him and see what he wants to do. So I go back and I said, Mr. Nixon, nothing's happened because you had wanted to have this confidential and nobody was to know. And he got furious. He said, damn it. He said, I'm going to have to go back there and go to that funeral if this is not – the whole purpose in our doing it was so that we would do it privately. We were not taking advantage of it. And we would not have to go to the funeral. So I went back, called Whitaker. Whitaker called Nick Ruhe. Nick Ruhe started calling radio stations saying, I think I saw President Nixon here, or former Vice President Nixon here visiting the King family. The radio stations called the King home, and the King family wouldn't confirm it because they had been told that it was to be confidential, that Mr. Nixon didn't want anybody to know, and they wouldn't confirm it. So, I mean, this thing was a disaster. So the story ends very nicely in the sense that Mr. Nixon went back for the funeral. We stayed at the Hyatt Hotel, Peachtree Street, and it was like an all-night wake there. I mean, it was just unbelievable. There was not one bottle of liquor left in the hotel. That's what we were told by the manager of the hotel. The next morning, Nixon went over to the Ebenezer Baptist Church. We had the same limo driver that we had had on the first trip. We pull up to the church as close as we can get, and it probably was close to, I want to say 50 yards from the church, because it was just this mass of humanity. I mean, it was just this massive crowd of people. And Mr. Nixon, the car pulled up, the door opened, he got out, and these citizens of Atlanta saw who it was, and they kind of backed off, and they made a little path, and you heard it start this clapping, and it just kept building. And all of a sudden, it got louder and louder, and it just like it parted, and he walked right on up and into the church. It was one of the most memorable things of the whole 1968 thing in my mind. I mean, it was just unbelievable. Mr. Nixon got into the church. He was taken to a seat. They had the services, and then after the services, we all go down into the basement. And here is Mr. Nixon standing there with Eugene McCarthy and Wilt Chamberlain and all these people, I mean, from the service. And of course, you got to keep in mind that he was going to do this privately to begin with. And now we're doing the ceremony, and we're standing in the church, down the basement of the church. Everything is ended, and we are supposed to get in the car and go, at which time Wilt Chamberlain or Eugene McCarthy or somebody says, are you going to march with us? Because the caisson was going to take the casket and go down the streets of Atlanta to the burial plot, and everybody was going to march behind the caisson to go. And so I see this look on Mr. Nixon's face, like, march? I mean, and the next thing I knew, here we were out there on the streets of Atlanta, marching down towards where the burial was going to be. And Nick Ruhe, the advance man, who realized this was getting to be something where we needed to figure out how we were going to gracefully depart, as we were going down the street, I saw him running, it's about a block ahead, and you could see that the road turned. There was a very sharp turn in the parade route. I call it a parade, but it was in the route. And so what Nick did is he went through there. He found a guy with a cab, a big cab. It was like a Cadillac or a big Oldsmobile or something, with a little sign on the top, taxi. He gave the guy a couple of $100, and when we went down to make the turn, I had told him that Nick had come back and said, when we make the turn, we're going to go straight ahead because there's a taxi waiting. So we're approaching the turn. Nixon turns to Wilt Chamberlain and says, Wilt's this big basketball player. I mean, he's a giant. He says, I'm going to have to depart here. I've got to get to the airport. And Wilt says, can I get a ride with you to the airport? And Nixon says, sure. So as we're turning, we've got, at this point, B.B. Rebozo, who had flown back up and gone for the funeral thing, although he had to wait outside the church. We've got Nixon, myself, and Wilt Chamberlain, and Nick Roy. There's 5 of us, plus the cab driver. So we go through the crowd, and here's the doors of the cab fly open. This guy has no idea who's about ready to get into his cab. He cannot believe it. He's got Wilt Chamberlain. He's got this. He looks in the mirror. You can. Then he turns around and he's trying to make sure that it's Richard Nixon. It was hilarious.